All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome to the session surrounding student engagement. My name is Shoshaunee, and let's go ahead and get started. So we'll kind of take a little bit slow as others are coming in. So we'll go ahead and start with an icebreaker. So feel free to drop this in the chat. So your name, where are you coming from, and what is one thing that you hope to learn about student engagement, or one thing that you hope to learn from this session in general. So the chat box is open. You can use the chat box here in Zoom to answer those questions. So your name, where you are coming from, and what is one thing you hope to learn about student engagement or take away from this session. Awesome. Welcome, Taylor. What inspires students? Paige from Fort Lewis, some strategies that they can use for their students and also resources. Absolutely. Nicole, learn what's a good way to gain a student's trust. Right. If you have anything else that you want to keep dropping in the chat, please feel free to do so, but we'll go ahead and keep moving on. Oh, I see one more thing. So Cynthia from Gallup, New Mexico. Learn how one keeps students excited to learn. Delphine from Arizona, engaging students in general. Awesome. Well, it gives me a lot of things to live up to. So we'll go ahead and keep going. All right, so I do want to start with the land acknowledgement. I am joining you today from the lands of the Lummi people and the Nuksak people here in Washington State. I live and reside in Bellingham. We acknowledge that there is a deep and enduring connection that Indigenous and Native peoples have with these territories in Washington State, a connection that spans generations. In recognizing this connection, we also confront the painful history of these regions, a history marked by racism and settler colonialism, displacement, genocide, coerced assimilation, and the persistent violations of tribal sovereignty. Despite these historical injustices, Indigenous and Native communities have persevered, maintaining a resilient and enduring bond with the land, air, and water. We understand that acknowledging the truth about the past is a crucial step toward building a more just and inclusive future. We acknowledge our responsibility to actively learn, listen, and speak of the truth. Our commitment extends beyond acknowledgement and involves active engagement in collaboration with Indigenous and Native colleagues and community members. This engagement and collaboration is reshaping our internal policies. I apologize, this is our land acknowledgement from my organization. We strive to work in solidarity, respecting and supporting the self-determination and resilience of these communities. By understanding the significance of this land and its history, we aim to contribute to a more equitable and just society for all. All right, I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself. So my name is Shoshaunee Perez. I go by Sho for most. I'm a direct descendant from Tulalip and Tlingit Haida on my mother's side. My mother is Dawn Elliott. My father is Timothy Barr. My maternal grandparents are Christine and Larry Elliott. My paternal grandparents are Glenda Davidson and Don Barr and the late Don Barr. My great grandmother is Catherine Elliott, and my Kaya or great grandmother is in Lashutsi is Catherine Bagley Campbell, whose name I carry. I'm an alumni of Northwest Indian College, having earned my bachelor's in the care program or the human services degree, and have recently earned my master's focused in adult education from Eastern Washington University in 2023. My current title is Rally for College Program Manager at College Success Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization based in the state of Washington. Oops, I'm gonna fix my little button here because I realized it doesn't say introduction. Based in the state of Washington that helps students, first generation, low income BIPOC students access higher education and persist and graduate from high school. Prior to stepping into this role, I had the great pleasure of serving as the first year experience advisor for Northwest Indian College for 6 years. Prior to that, I worked in admissions for 4. All of this leading to say I have amassed over a decade in higher education with everything from admissions to placement testing. And I also am an adjunct faculty member teaching first year experience, so first quarter course for students at Northwest Indian College as well. Outside of that, I am a mom of a loving 4-year-old little girl. I am also a softball wife. My husband has been a softball player for 16 years. And I'm a really big lover and advocate of educational access as well. So just an overview of what we're going to cover here in about the next 40 minutes, which seems like a long time, but I feel like it's never enough. We're going to talk a little bit about the background, literature and data, things to think about, some engagement practices that you may be able to use, references, and hopefully have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions and thought processes here at the very end. So in order to understand where the problem lies, especially with student engagement, we do need to have a little bit of background information. So let's take some time to explore some facts here. So we do have to break this information into 2 sections. The first is being what the literature says about high school students, specifically entering post-secondary education, and what that has to say. So these are some perceived barriers that have come from literature surrounding communities and not necessarily student engagement practices, but having Indigenous students accessing higher education. So things such as difficulty leaving their homes and families, culture shock, being underprepared for academic rigor or low academic achievement, financial support, socioeconomic status of parents, low parental involvement, participation in college, high percentage of special education students, belief in necessity of post-secondary education. Apparently my brain can't get those words out today. Individuation versus family interdependence, internal difficulties to take risks, institutional lack of guidance, social connection, reservation life, high school preparation for college, confidence in relation to college, and historical trauma all are playing a part in students' ability to access education or staying engaged in high school after high school and engaging in post-secondary education. Based off of those perceived barriers, here are some suggested solutions that come from the literature that was reviewed prior to this. So it is things such as, there we go. Networking to foster success, so connecting students early on with their peers that may be in post-secondary education to be able to access, to get that networking connection going as well. And then also immersion programs, develop positive and trusting relationships with colleges, campus social support, social events to retain students, tribal support, college going attitudes by high school counselors, family support, including family or support systems in any future planning, culturally relevant supports and resources within colleges, and then summer preparatory programs such as American Indian College Fund Pathways, College Horizons, and other bridge programs that may exist already as well. So we talked a little bit about what the literature has talked about, right? So what are some of the promising practices or problems that are being seen specifically by those in higher education? So let's talk about data next. So the cold hard facts, so data specifically. So with that, let's talk a little bit about graduation rates. So there is a 75% graduation rate for Indigenous students in the US. With that also being said, the data shows that there is a 25 to 36% dropout rate for students between the 7th and 12th grade. This figure here specifically is to depict the number of youth that earned their high school diploma in 2020. So 75% of youth earned their high school diploma in 2020. I know this slide is going to look a little bit text heavy and a little bit difficult to read. This slide really specifically is about the number or the percentage of students who graduated from a 4-year post-secondary education institution to complete their bachelor's degree. So from 1986 through 2016. The positive thing here is if you notice, the number did take a little bit of a dip right around here, but pretty consistently has been increasing over time. So going from 21.6% to 24.5%, 26.2%, so on and so forth. So what we can really tell from that is that there are some really positive things and positive engagement practices that are coming from some of the things that we are already doing that are helping students to be able to stay in school and to be able to graduate on time as well. So in December of 2023, a report by the Center for First Generation Success reported that 64% of the Indigenous population are considered first generation. So what does that mean for us as practitioners, right? This means that students are showing up in college spaces, first feeling like they don't belong, but also that they don't have the tools necessary to be successful, including support networks, knowledge of systems, develop soft skills such as time management, study habits, and potentially even what it is that they want to study. So that can also be things that you see here on the screen as well, such as the fear of the unknown, lack of support from outside of the classroom, lack of preparedness. And it's also stated that from the Center for First Generation Student or Generation Success, that these first generation students are more likely to leave college after their first year than those of their peers, which is a really big thing. That means that we as practitioners only really get about 1 year with them to really help connect with them and keep them engaged and in school pursuing their degrees. I think it's also important to talk about Native views of success in relation to education. And so some of those views include things such as reciprocity. So educators learning just as much as the students do in the classroom. Native students are driven by value. So driven by the value, by their very specific values that they have been brought up on. And then they have a very strong want to give back to their community. It's really important to talk about this very specifically because this can help us frame some of the conversations, some of the engagement practices that we're going to be looking at and talking about. All right, I don't know why this one likes to get stuck. This one got stuck last time too. All right, so some things to specifically think about here. So while I was at Northwest Indian College, I'm an alum of Northwest Indian College, having earned my bachelor's degree. I completed something called my capstone on, which was focused on removing barriers to higher education for Indigenous students. While completing that project, I hosted story sharing sessions with practitioners in the field of education that included those that worked with high-risk students, also a dean of academics as well to the college. And to hear what they had to say about what they saw and heard as the barriers to education. So those that participated in the story sharing sessions with me share the following things to think about for our students on their path to education. Most students, so this is a quote from one of the participants, that I worked with, which is most Native students I've encountered are not able to have future thinking, but instead are usually in survival thinking. It makes it difficult to think about going to school when you are worried about surviving. I'm going to read that last part one more time. It makes it difficult to think about going to school when you are worried about surviving. And we know that that is the typical case for many of our students that we potentially are working with. It's really hard to focus on writing your English paper when you're worried about where you're going to rest your head that night, or where your next healthy meal or meal in general is going to come from, or where you're going to be safe. Some of these are the things that those that participated in the story sharing sessions shared with me. Family dynamics, specifically the lack of familial conversations regarding college, and academic underpreparedness, state requirements for teachers, state retention for school districts, financial barriers, specifically the financial barrier being a fear to students, right, that want to not go to college because it's expensive and they don't want to leave college with debt. A large population of first generation students and families. So again, right, going back to that, 64%. Culture shock in attending these institutions. A very strong push for apprenticeships at a variety of different schools, meaning that these students are not necessarily thinking about going to liberal studies-based schools, but are more interested or thinking about going into apprenticeship programs where they can learn while they earn while they learn, so they're able to work, get on the job training. The want to survive, and the concept that poverty inhibits future thinking, right? So students may be thinking day to day rather than year to year. The fear of not belonging, being in an era of instant gratification with things such as TikTok and Snapchat and all kinds of other things that exist in terms of social media. A battle between culture and education. What happens, sometimes our students thinking about what happens if I leave home, will I be accepted when I come back? You know, how do I participate in my culture and in my traditional ceremonies while I'm away at school? And an idea of a utopian concept as well. So acknowledging these systemic traumas and challenges that our students face and are more likely to bring up in the classroom is important. We can't ask our students to leave these at the door. So these experiences make up who they are and are often why they chose to pursue higher education in the first place. Along with this is understanding our own bias, which none of us are able to say we don't have. An example of my own personal bias comes from my mother's own success as a single mom of 3 girls going to school full-time while working. I never knew that I would see this play out in my own work. However, after attending a NACADA conference session, so the National Academy or Association for College Academic Advising in Kentucky, I was able to see that where I let my bias play out into conversations with students about their own personal struggles and even in the words and phrases that I would use. There were times where I would work with when I was working for Northwest Indian College, the typical student at Northwest Indian College is a single mom in her 30s that is usually working at least a part-time job to survive. And I would oftentimes find myself using that very simple phrase. My mom was a single mom who went to college as well and was able to graduate. I'm sure you can do it too. And I didn't realize that bringing in my personal bias almost kind of immediately stopped the conversation that I was having with that specific student, where I was not able to continue to
that conversation and feel that, or have that student feel that they were supported. Everyone has their own definition of success, and for some that can simply be making it to class on time. When working with a student, take a moment and ask them what their definition of success is. Not only will this help you build a deeper connection to your students, but will allow you to create a point to come back to later. And ask a student to do some reflective work on. This is a conversation that I have not only when working with students when I was an advisor, but this is also a conversation that I have with my students inside the classroom as well. I oftentimes every quarter, usually within the first couple of weeks, usually during week 2, I ask my students to write down their own definition of success in relation to education and to share it with one another and also to share it with me. It really gives me a moment to come back into this place in order to be able to share with these students and kind of have some more guided, directed conversations around what their definition of success is. To also to teach your students the hidden curriculum. So remember that a vast majority of our students in your space will be first generation and not have had conversations about FAFSA scholarships, the importance of college, or even what they want to be outside of school in their homes. They are likely to mimic what they see as success in their homes, but having this open conversation and teaching these things allows for students to have a greater sense of empowerment and confidence in navigating these systems. It's to think about the systems that students may need to be a part of. So navigating financial aid and scholarships and financial barriers, and keeping students engaged in those practices so that they're able to have better control over their own education and be able to make and think about those decisions for themselves as well. Within the hidden curriculum is also teaching students that it's okay to fail and how their struggles actually make them extremely resilient and stronger learners rather than a hindrance to their success. In relation to self-efficacy, speak confidence into them by truly celebrating their successes and accomplishments. I think it's one of the stories that I share is when I was an advisor, I often had students come into my office and say, hey, Sho, I have to withdraw from my classes. I'm really sorry. It was almost a point of shame that the students would come in and oftentimes felt that they had to apologize to me for having to withdraw, usually due to some sort of life circumstance that was beyond their control. And for a long time, I didn't really acknowledge or work to correct their thought process and their idea. And so I wouldn't really acknowledge them apologizing to me because I didn't think that they needed to. But as time grew, I started to very directly acknowledge to students, you don't need to apologize to me for something. You're not doing something wrong. You're making a decision that you're kind of working through a decision of something that you need to work on throughout your time. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with having to do that. And coming back later when the time is right for you is absolutely okay. And normalizing that conversation with students if they do have to disengage for a specific amount of time. And then lastly, meet students and families where they are. We must understand that students are likely to bring their support networks into these conversations, and we must not reproduce the same conversation with every student. So making sure that we don't have the same elevator pitch and speech to every single student, but really hear what the student needs and really hear where kind of their level of starting out is, because they may be starting out at the ground floor, but some students may have already also done some work and come to you with a much more deepened sense of connection of knowing where they want to go. Taking a moment to hear the student out about their experience and their journey will help you to determine where they need the support, and remembering that this can look different in every scenario. Oops. What's going on here? Nope. Okay. I was on the right slide. I'm looking at a totally different screen. I do want to take a moment and talk a little bit more about self-efficacy specifically. So self-efficacy is defined as a belief or confidence in oneself in specific situations. So it's situational specific rather than something such as self-confidence, which is an overall concept and belief in oneself in total. And so it's important to note that self-efficacy can look different, say for a student that may excel in math and not excel in English, or vice versa. And it really is also based on their previous experiences as well. So it's based on previous experiences that they've had with the subject or the thing that they are working on. There are 4 defined and distinct ways to build self-efficacy in students. That are very straightforward and I don't want to say simple, but are pretty straightforward for us to do in these places and spaces. So the first is mastery experiences. So mastery experiences are those experiences where students are able to try something and succeed at it, and then in turn, hopefully gain more self-efficacy in themselves. So for example, if it's helping a student, directing a student toward completing a scholarship and they get the scholarship, and then they're more likely to continue to repeat the process because they are growing and building that sense of self-efficacy. Vicarious experiences. So vicarious experiences would be those where students are able to see someone that they identify with in some sort of fashion. So for example, if it's a single mom with children who's working a part-time job while going to school full-time, is able to see someone with the same sort of experience be able to be successful in their classes and stay engaged and to graduate. It's extremely, it helps them to be able to create and build confidence and self-efficacy within themselves in that very specific situation. Verbal persuasion, we all probably as practitioners do this on a very consistent, continual basis. So saying things, really priding students on a job well done, sharing with them that you're able to see the hard work and strength and the resiliency that they have is also extremely important. And then emotional and physiological states as well. So emotional and physiological states really have to do with the concept of our brain and our body being tied together. And if our brain and our body being tied together is not working in a very consistent, cohesive fashion, sometimes that can create some dissonance or some disconnect as well for those that are trying to build their self-efficacy. There's a little bit more framework and work being done in this fifth experience. It's not one that there's a lot of research or data driven around. This is an experience that I use very often in my classroom settings, and it's called the imaginal experience. And so somebody may be going, show how in the world do you use an imaginal experience in a classroom setting? So again, I primarily teach Introduction to Successful Learning. So I'm teaching students in their first quarter of college, really trying to give them the ground level floor of skills that they can take forward, and then also to really enhance that college going belief in themselves. And so the imaginal experience that I will use with my students is usually during like the second week is after teaching what self-efficacy is and talking through that with students, is I will do a self-efficacy, like a visualization process with students where I have them close their eyes and I kind of go through like a story or depiction of this student walking, pulling together their cap and gown, putting their cap and gown on, walking, hearing their name, walking across the stage, having their family and friends clap and cheer and celebrate for them. Also being able to really kind of just have them process through that moment. Oftentimes when I do this experience, I do have students that will come away from that with tears in their eyes and saying they could hear and smell and, sometimes taste, if I go into the concepts of having dinner afterwards, these things that they once had never thought of being possible. And I will say that I have kind of qualitative based is that I have seen students that I had at the very beginning who were sort of lackluster and maybe not as engaged in my classroom space because maybe there just wasn't the connection to some of the material that we were talking about. Once they've kind of gone through this imaginal experience, I have seen a huge transition in my students being much more connected to the material and asking questions and just being engaged overall, which I think is extremely important for us to think about because that really creates an opportunity for students really to visualize and be completely engaged in the moments and the things that we're talking about. I also wanted to share some tips for class-based work or things that practitioners could really kind of take away as tangible touch points for creating self-efficacy. So offering spaces for collaborative learning so students can gain confidence by working with their peers and working through challenges. Creating more of a progress-oriented assessment, so comparing students' performance against standard set goals and outcomes rather than against each other. Right. And so utilizing class outcomes or those sorts of things rather than pitting students against each other is a really good idea. Quick win assignments. So scheduling a low stakes assignment early in the term to build self-confidence. So an example of one of these things that I did specifically this quarter for one of my classes was we reviewed the syllabus, and after we were done reviewing the syllabus, we kind of took like an open notes quiz. And so it was low stakes in the sense that we all answered the questions together. So as long as the students participated directly in class and opened up the quiz and participated, they were able to pass the quiz. Some of the other language that it's not necessarily a quick when, but some of the other language that I use with my students inside my classroom is I always tell my students at the very beginning, you start with an A in the class. It is up to you to keep it there. It's the same thing that I tell students when I was an advisor. I used to tell students, you start with a 4.0 when they're applying for scholarships. It is up to you to keep it there. And so it's really important to just kind of start with some of those concepts. So students, because some students can walk into our classroom and into our spaces and thinking that they're kind of starting at the bottom and have to work their way up, rather than they already have this skill set and these enhanced knowledges that they're bringing into our classroom spaces and are really strong in the capacity. And therefore, they just have to keep enhancing those and build into those. Self-reflection and self-assessment activities. So reflection is one of the easiest, or one of the not easiest, but one of the best tools that can often be used with students. One of the ways that I use this specifically inside my classroom space is I start every class with some sort of question, video, or quote, usually directly connected to the material that I'm teaching. But I give students about 5 minutes to think about the question, answer the question in their notes, and to then do a peer-to-peer share out. So we just open the floor space and we open the conversation and the question. And then it's also important as well that as an educator that you participate in those same conversations that you're asking your students to participate in. So if you're asking a reflection question, it's also just as important that you will answer that reflection question as you would asking your students. I also provide self-assessment activities for my students throughout the course of the quarters. So starting out at the beginning of the quarter, students get to take some very low stakes assessments on their study skills, their procrastination skills, and things along those lines. And then they also take them again at the end of the quarter to kind of really be able to see how, after hearing and developing some of these skills, that they're able to build that self-efficacy and that they're able to see that confidence grow and kind of the growth that they have had throughout the course of the quarter. So it's kind of a self-assessment, self-reflection tied into one. Frame failure as part of the learning process. And not only just framing failure as part of the learning process, but then also really making sure that you are having very direct guided conversations about growth mindset. It's one of the biggest things that's not talked about in education. I do directly teach my students, usually in the second or third week. It's usually about the third week. I teach my students about growth mindset and self-efficacy. So they're able to understand that language and that knowledge and can find themselves to use it when they're trying to overcome or persevere through a challenge. So I think it's super important to be able to share that information and to start normalizing failure rather than failure being a terrible thing. And one of the ways that I try and really do that and even kind of bring in the self-reflection piece is I do work on each week after I've completed grading, I do try and reach out to my students in my class and share with them where they're at. Along with kind of one of the other ways of teaching the hidden curriculum is I also have a like one-pager flyer with all of the resources that exist at the college that one lives at the top of my Canvas page because I teach virtually, but lives at the top of my Canvas page for my students to access anytime that they need to. But then I also attach it to every Canvas message when I'm reaching out to a student if they're not doing well in class. So they have on-hand resources that they can access that are completely free to them as students to use. So I think it's extremely important. And I also change the language when I'm reaching out to the student. And I really focus on future thinking language and really trying to build up a network of support. How can we get you past this failing grade? What can I do to support you? And really asking for students to kind of connect with me in that capacity. And then again, just sharing words of encouragement with students as well. I think it's super important to remind our students just how much we appreciate them and how well they are doing, because again, some of our students are coming into these places and spaces, just really trying to survive and to thrive, and maybe struggling in doing so. And so being able to acknowledge their where they're coming from and the things that they have going on, I think is super important and part of that conversation. All right. I wanted to open up the floor to any questions. Are there any questions that y'all have for me? Don't be shy. Okay, I'll turn a question on you. What may, out of some of the engagement practices that you heard, what is one that you want to try and take away back to your learning spaces for your students? Visualization. Yes. I love it, Melissa. Visualization, doing the imaginal experience is by far one of my favorite experiences to do inside the classroom. um, Anybody else have a practice that they want to bring forth into their space? Normalizing failure is a big one for my students because the pre-collegiate program I'm in can be daunting to my students, I've noticed. Absolutely. And I think, Paige, something for you to potentially think about, and this was something that was, it took me a minute to do because, again, I had to really recognize when I come back to the conversation about bias, I had to recognize that I had the privilege of being a second generation college student because my mom was the first in my family to go to college, albeit she didn't really teach me how to go to college. I still had to figure it out. But something about normalizing failure is not only normalizing it, but then creating a space and kind of looking at what is the hidden curriculum of the pre-collegiate program that you're in. What are some of those things that we go, oh, duh, students should know that, but maybe they just don't know that. So if you have a student that's coming to you for support, that you could hand them something or say, here's a really great resource that you could use. And for me, the resources that I started to create were things such as this for my students was like the Student Connections program at our college, which is specific to like coaching and helping students, looking at the Math and Writing Center for tutoring, looking at disability accommodations, right? Because oftentimes we know that potentially a student has some sort of accommodation that they need and they're just afraid or don't know how to go through that process. And then also making sure to always have my mental health resources that are available to my students first and foremost, because then that way the student has that at their hands. So I think definitely normalizing failure and then also creating some sort of maybe a supporting or guiding document might be a really great option for your program to help keep students engaged. I like to take a look at each student as unique and they are not all under the same need or same services. Absolutely. Every student is unique. Their story is unique. And the thing that they're going to come to the table with as well. So I can definitely see that maybe sometimes they might not want to share what they don't know, especially when with others in the program. Yes. I always giggle because I do the teacher thing when I teach, and I always tell my students, I say the same thing. I always say there's in a room full of 10 of you, there's at least 3 of you that have the same question as the person sitting next to you or virtually, right, sitting next to you. And they're just as afraid to ask me as you are. And I always tell my students as well, it's like, you can ask me offline. So you can text me the question and I'll answer. You can direct message me the question and I'll answer it. So it kind of reduces that stigma. But really just kind of creating that safe learning space is also a really great idea for sure. Any other thoughts or questions? Sorry. You're welcome, Paige. And based in that as well, I was going to say, so I have resources. I'm more than happy to share the PowerPoint with you. Some of these resources do come from when I completed my capstone in 2019, but there's still some really good relevant research and resources about Indigenous students accessing post-secondary education, which I really appreciated. So please feel free if you want those. But here is my contact information as well. So again, I work for College Success Foundation. So that is my email and my direct phone number as well. So I'm more than happy to answer questions that you have or connect outside of this about Indigenous education and things along those lines. Promising practices, I think we have to create some really strong groups and networks of Indigenous practitioners that just are willing to share information with one another so we can learn how to best support our students. Because if we all know anything, the trends in education and the era of education is always changing and growing. And so there's always some sort of best new practice that is out there or trying practice that we find that works really well. So you're welcome, Sheila. With that, we have about 8 minutes left. I will leave this up for just a second, but I will also hang back if anybody has any questions. This session ends at 4:50, and then there is a closing session, or I'm sorry, I'm in Pacific Standard Time, so it's 4:50 my time, so 5:50 Mountain Standard Time. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to hang back. But thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you found some really great practices and we get to connect together in the future about engaging more and more students in post-secondary education. So thanks for being with me all, and I will talk to you soon. Could I go back to the references slide? Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, of course I hit stop share as soon as I saw that, Melissa. I'm more than happy. I'll go back to, I have 2 of them, so I'll go back to the one before it. There we go. So there's this reference slide. Was there one that you were specifically looking for? That's one of them. And then this is the second set of references. And if you want to drop me your email, I'm also really happy to share the PowerPoint deck with you. It has all the references in it as well. Awesome, y'all. Well, thank you for being with me. It was great to, oh, awesome. It was great to be here with all of you today. I hope you all had a great session, and I will connect with you all at a later time. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.